Harper, I just said a lot of nice things about you in Icelandic. You just might get embarrassed if I translate that all. But one thing that I mentioned, that you were CTO for an Obama campaign in 2012. There seems to be a lot of Icelandic citizens wanting to run for president, so you might be asked to help them. Mr. Harper, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello. So I'm Harper. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I did not understand anything, which is actually how I prefer it. So this is my Twitter handle. Please follow me on Twitter, ask questions or whatever. I'd like to continue the conversation. But it also is, this is the only reason I talk in public, is my social media strategy, to get up here and tell all y'all to follow me. It kind of seems more elaborate than it needs to be. So today I'm going to talk about a couple things, really two things, effective use of data and financial product design. My background is I'm basically a product designer. I spent a lot of time thinking about products, but have spent a lot of time recently in fintech, so hopefully those two gel together. It's going to be pretty fun, but before I get there, I'm going to talk about my favorite thing in the entire world, myself. Just a second. So anyway, how many people know who these people are? A few? Okay, so wait, I guess I should ask that differently. How many people don't know who these people are? Okay, a handful. So this is Steve Jobs, it's Steve Wozniak, and some other guy. I'm not sure who that is. But these guys kind of invented Apple II computers, or Apple computers, but more importantly, they kind of invented the world of computing. This is the first computer that I used when I was a child. I got this computer, my parents gave it to me, I learned to program it, it was amazing. Any people here early Apple users? Okay, good, a handful. It was fun. Has anyone here read this book, Hackers? Really good book. You should all read it. It's about the kind of history of computers, the history of open source, and the history of hackers. But I read this book when I was very young. I read it and I was just like, wait a minute. Everything started to click together. All of these ideas of sharingness, openness, or sharing openness, collaboration, this idea of engaging on the hands-on imperative, all this stuff kind of started clicking, and I realized, much to my parents' unhappiness, that I'm a hacker. And I went to school for computer science and all that stuff, and so, traditionally, I guess I'm classically trained as a coder. But has anyone heard of this company? Threadless? So Threadless was this really interesting company. I started Threadless in like 2005-ish. Threadless was this kind of very normal-ish t-shirt company, but they did something that was rather remarkable. They accidentally invented crowdsourcing. And so we didn't really know what crowdsourcing was. We didn't mean to invent anything. All we knew is we went to a conference when we were much younger at this place, MIT, and they introduced this, and they said, this is Threadless. They invented crowdsourcing. And we were just like, crowd what? We had no idea what this is, because for us, it was very simple. We wanted to take this and turn it into that. A very simple thing, but using obviously the wisdom of the crowd. And the crowd is the most important thing here. And really there was just four simple steps. The first one is the crowd, like all of y'all, would design a great t-shirt or upload a design. Then you'd submit it to Threadless. And then the crowd itself would all score this shirt. Everyone would vote on it, whether it was good or not. And then cash money would fall into our pockets. This worked out very, very well. And this was a really fun business because we got to make products that we liked. We got to make these amazing shirts. It was fun. It was a lot of votes, a lot of designs uploaded. We sold millions of t-shirts and we grew from X to XX. I'm apparently not allowed to talk about revenue. Keep getting in trouble. But the best part of, because it was crowdsourcing, is we didn't have to do any of the hard work. We just did the easiest part about taking money, which is my favorite part. The tech stack was very straightforward. This was 2005-ish, so it was PHP and MySQL, really easy and understood. But what this allowed, since it was easy, was it allowed us to focus on the product, which is the most important part. Around 2009, I realized I had accomplished all of my goals, and I set out to do the one thing that I invite everyone to do today. I quit my job. Who's with me? Okay, there's one person in the back, a couple over there. We'll talk later and we can start a company or something. But then around this time, I went on a vision quest. Does anyone here know what a vision quest is? Okay, we have a handful of people. I think that person is raising their hand twice, though. A vision quest is really, I guess I've learned recently that this is a very American idea. A vision quest is when you go into the desert, you do a lot of drugs, and you try and find your spirit animal. I did not do that. I joined a VC firm. I think it's similar. And I did that because I wanted to find out how companies were built. And in that regard, in that part of my life, that was kind of my spirit animal, this idea of how are companies built? How do we do big things? And so when this really giant thing kind of reached out to me and said, Harper, would you like to help out? This guy actually right here, Michael Slaby, he reached out and he said, Harper, would you like to help out? I had to, of course, say yes. Michael Slaby was the CTO in 2008. And what that meant in 2008, I'll talk about in a minute, but here I am in 2012. This is my official campaign photo. So in 2012, this is quite a thing. It was really an exciting time. And one of the questions that I often get asked is, why Harper? The first person that asked this question, obviously, was my mother. And the way to really answer this question is you have to look at the difference between 2008 and 2012. In 2008, the Obama campaign was a startup. Anyone here work in startups before? A handful. Well, you know, startups are weird. Startups are these things, nobody knows if they're going to last a couple weeks, a couple months, a couple years. It's all risk. It's 100% risk. You never know if you're going to survive. And so everything you do is about survival. Whereas when you're this enterprise, you know you're going to survive. So it's a different game a little bit. And so when they hired me, they were like, okay, well, you know, what are you going to do? And immediately I thought, well, we need to hire engineers. And so I was describing this to my wife, who's Japanese, and she said this, which I don't know Japanese. We translated it into this, mochi wa mochi ya. And once again, I'm just like, okay. But she would continue to explain. This is this Japanese saying that's really interesting, which is, you know, when you want to get rice cakes, you actually should go to the rice cake store. You shouldn't necessarily go to the gas station for rice cakes. You get crappy rice cakes at the gas station. And so I'm just like, okay. Like still, this is what I'm saying, okay, and you guys are like, what's happening? Why is he talking about this? But the reason is because for the first time in any political campaign in the United States, we actually needed engineers to come and help. We needed them to come and work. And so we had to go, to get those engineers, we had to go where the engineers were. We no longer could do what we did in previous elections, which is we just gather anyone. Someone would come on and you'd say, what do you do? And they'd say, oh, I'm an architect. And then they'd say, okay, you're now an HTML person. They say, oh, what do you do? And you're like, I'm you know, a nurse. And you're like, okay, now you're over here doing this other thing. Because the startup, all roles are the same. But in the enterprise, we really need engineers to do engineering. And this was an interesting innovation that sounds foreign to all of us because it's how we would normally work. But we hired a boatload of engineers. One of the big teams was about 40 people. We hired them from all of these companies you might recognize. That's obviously the most important one. We had about 120 tech staff. And the key here is that that's about 10 times the tech staff that we had in 2008. We started from absolutely zero. When I walked in April 2011, I stepped in and there was nothing. And I was just like, what happened to all the code? They're like, what code? There's nothing. And we had about 18 months. And so with 18 months, that seems like a very long time. But it was very short, so we had to focus only on one thing, and that was purely execution. This is the number one thing. And so, oh yeah, I forgot about this cake. This is our don't fuck it up cake. This is the first thing that my boss said to me when I joined. He was like, Harper, glad to have you, don't fuck it up. And I was just like, okay. But also this is a cake that one of my engineers made. The engineer makes this cake about a week before Election Day, takes it and sets it, in front of all the engineers, and all the engineers look at it, and we look at that guy, and we look at it. Because at this point, we're very superstitious. We're worried that if we eat this cake, then we might lose. So we all just leave it there, and like 2 weeks go by, and then they ate it, which was way sketchier. But anyway, so we built this platform, and the platform was really straightforward. It was this giant platform, and it was really important. It was actually called Narwhal. And how many people know what a narwhal is? Probably a handful. You probably eat them here. Do you eat narwhal here? No. Oh, so anyway, this is Jim Messina. This is my boss, photoshopped as a narwhal. Here he is as Harry Potter. The campaign was really, really stressful. It was really crazy. It was a stressful thing. And so we tried to have a lot of fun. So all of these images were photoshopped, and we put them at the last slide of a presentation. The presentations were usually really important presentations. The last slide would be this. It'd be a little like thought bubble, and it would say questions. And then we just did that for fun, but the first question was always like, what's wrong with you? Anyway, so Narwhal was this really big concept. It was this really fun thing that we decided to do. Fun might be the wrong word, but it was a big idea, which was if you have this API as the foundation, then you get the freedom to focus on the products, which once again is the most important thing. We had all of these important products. Our call to a product was this really interesting product that allowed anyone that wanted to volunteer for the campaign to call and connect with various constituents, to remind people to vote, etc. Dashboard was kind of a business process management app that allowed people to interact with the campaign and see people around them. Our mobile apps were very good. We've had both Android and iPhone, but more importantly, 100% of our apps, internally and external on the web, were responsive. When you have huge numbers of volunteers, like my coworkers, when I started, there was 40 people. In the end, there was about 2.5 million people that worked with us. And so you don't know who those people are. You don't know what devices they're bringing. This is the ultimate in bring your own device. And so everything has to work on all devices, which is really important. Our contributions apps were really good. I'll talk about that in a second. And social media is boring, obviously. But big data is fun, right? Everyone here loves big data? Yay, big data. Well, I'm going to talk about the innovation of big data, but actually before that, I'm going to have a little bit of an intervention here. Hopefully this isn't too disruptive. But big data, I think big data is bullshit. And I say that for one thing only, which is the big, because the big part here is solved. We should just be talking about data, no longer big, because this is the hard drive, right? That's pretty well solved. There's very few applications, very few businesses that have a problem storing their data. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I want to talk about questions and answers, and I want to talk about big answers, not big data. That's the end of my little intervention. So anyway, the innovation was obviously data, and the media in the US especially loves data. When you talk about data, they love it. So here, let's do a Google query real quick. That's pretty boring. Let's make it better. Micro-targeting. Does anyone here know what micro-targeting is? Okay, not very many people. Well, I'm not really going to tell you, but we'll act like we all know. And the reason for this is because this is where it gets really exciting. I have no idea why it says nuclear codes there. It's not that exciting. But this is the best picture on the internet. This is a horse holding a cat on a boat. When do you see that? Anyway, micro-targeting is super exciting. This is really fun. And what micro-targeting really is, it's about me using data to make sure that advertising, etc., speaks directly to you. Here's a tweet from a friend of mine named Dan Sinker. This tweet was done in, I think, November or October 2008. The reason this is up here is because I want to demonstrate that all we do is send email, just email. Email every day, all the time. And the reason is because email works really, really well. So let's look at some emails. So this is an email that I received. I think this was, I'm not sure when it was, October maybe, of 2012. The important thing about this email is right there, that $56. And the reason that that's important is because that is an amount of money that we used a lot of math and analytics to say, how much would Harper donate? How much would Harper contribute to this campaign? And so we looked at all my previous contributions and we said, it's probably $56. We put that in an email, we sent that to me, and then this is one of the bigger innovations that we made, which I'll talk about in a little bit later, is it was called this product called Quick Donate, where what we did is when you clicked Quick Donate, we immediately took the money. We did not ask. Now, for some reason, in Europe specifically, everyone laughs about this because I think this is incredibly illegal. But this alone, without having, obviously you enrolled in it, but when you clicked Quick Donate and we took that money, that alone gave us a lift of about $250 million. So it's really impressive and really innovative. Facebook, when I said social media was boring, what I meant very specifically was oftentimes when you talk about social media, we talk about what's your social media plan or what is your plan to get people on your social media, your Facebook page or whatever, and it's a lot of buzzwords. I can't even emulate buzzwords, I'm bad at it, but it's a lot of buzzwords. But what we did instead is we said, what if everyone logged in and we grabbed a boatload of data here, and then we started blending that with our emails. So here's another email that we sent. This email was really interesting because it has a couple of personalization points. North Carolina, John Ruth. What we did is we went through and looked at 100% of my Facebook data. And how many people here are on Facebook? Handful? Okay. Everyone in the world's on Facebook. It's kind of scary, right? But here's the thing about Facebook. We all have those friends that like every single update, right? Does that happen? Yeah? And what we did is we went and looked at all of our data. We found all those friends that liked every single update. We then found the smaller set of those friends that you're tagged with in photos, that you're checked in with in locations, that all of these the circle starts to get much smaller. And that's where this John Ruth comes from. That is my best friend. So we use math and analytics to go through all of your Facebook data and determine who your best friend was. Then we were able to send an email to you that says, why don't you reach out to the person that you influence the most, your best friend. So now, where this is interesting is we had to do a lot of work to figure out how do we make this not creepy, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We also did a lot with SMS. SMS is really interesting, specifically in the US. It's probably interesting elsewhere, but SMS has a huge, like 100% open rate. It's an amazing medium. But I was really worried about SMS because I thought it was going to turn out like this, where we were going to screw it up. We were going to take people's money. But it worked out really, really well. Worked out so well. We did this on New Year's Eve. Everyone loved it. I'm positive it worked out like that. One of the things about emails is we did a lot of testing. And so one of the keys with testing is that we did a lot with subject lines. So the subject lines we tested a lot. Emails, for the most part, were really important to us. We raised about $640 million via email. This was huge. But one of the lessons that still resonates with me today is this lesson about subject lines. So obviously this is the President of the United States, hopefully forever. But the president is very presidential, and that sounds like a silly comment, that the president is very presidential. But what that means is the president doesn't say, hey. The president is not casual. The president doesn't say, oh, hey, Harper, what's going on? The president, I guess, I don't know what something, not casual, salutations, Harper, or something really. But the thing is that when we did a lot of testing, we had a subject line where we pushed it out, and the subject line was just, hey, from Barack Obama, hey. And it was a test. And everyone was like, well, the president wouldn't say hey. So we did this test, and everyone was just like, okay, very nervous. And then we made a boatload of money from that email. And then from then on, the president said hey. And so the lesson here is that sometimes we have these ideas about our brands, about our products, et cetera, that they only work one way. But using some testing and some analytics, we can determine that they actually work many different ways. And that was really important. All this data stuff helped us a lot. We raised boatloads of dollars, better content distribution, and obviously the most important thing for us was more efficient voter contact. Our technology was really straightforward. How many technologists are here? Handful? Okay, good. We used a lot of Python, but actually we used everything. We used MySQL as our main data store, but we used a lot of other stuff as well. StatsD was really great. We used Puppet and Vagrant for development. We used Ubuntu because we're adults. We like to call this the use all the things framework, just because it was like this. Someone would say, hey, I want to use this, and we'd be like, okay. From an infrastructure standpoint, we were pretty much cloud all the way. And the reason is because we had to use the cloud. We had 200 products that were deployed weekly. We had this huge architecture, thousands and thousands of servers, and here's actually the architecture diagram for OFA. My favorite part is in a second, just a sec. Wait for it. Okay. Right here, those two things there are complete copies of what you see go by. So what was exciting about this is this entire infrastructure was built by 4 people. That is the entire ops team, the entire sysadmin team that we had, 4 people. And it was all done 100% with software. There were no hardware involved. This changed everything. This allowed us to really do what we needed to do and invest when we needed that rather than invest at the end. And the key here is that we required the cloud. We could not have done any of this without the cloud there. So all this technology was really important, but the key here, once again, was that it allowed us to have that simplicity to focus exactly on the problem. And because failure was not an option, we invested heavily in user experience. Are there any user experience folks here? Okay, there's 2. It's pretty typical, sadly. User experience is the most important thing. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But we did a lot of testing. And the key here with testing is we tested a lot. We did this thing what we called practicing failure, where we would go ahead and we would just emulate what it looked like when disaster happened. The thing is we thought we were inventing this in the campaign, but the key is that in the campaign world, they practiced failure constantly. They had mock election days. They did lots of testing. Election day was pretty chill, obviously no more changes. Here is a sticky note that I found on election day. It was pretty good, and obviously we won, which meant that we didn't invade Canada, which I was very happy about. So after this, I went on another vision quest. Once again, no deserts and no drugs. But this time we started a company called Modest. I try and name most things after myself. And we had a very simple goal. And the simple goal was, for the last 15 years, we'd been building e-commerce experiences. And all of those 15 years, we had invested almost only in the back end. And so what the back end for us meant was, making payments faster, but for the bank. Making it so that the warehouses were faster, but not necessarily for the user. And so we decided to change the program. How can we, and what would happen if for the first time in our 15 years career of building all of this great software that we focused on the user, the consumer? And how does that change things once you do that? So we decided to set out and we built this experience that we felt was a better commerce experience. It was quicker, it was friendlier, and I think the most important thing here was it was only mobile. And so the thing that we saw with retailers was that mobile was the only thing they didn't have. So we decided to say that we can change that. So this was really exciting. It worked out really well. And then I found the greatest cheat code for any startup in the world, which is to sell your company to PayPal. So did that, and then we launched this product called PayPal Commerce. It's really exciting. You should check it out. But I'm not here to talk about that today. But I'm here to start my presentation. That was just the intro. So a couple things to keep in mind. The first one is your mileage may vary. I have a handful of things to say here. They've worked very well for me and my teams, but hopefully they'll work for you. The first one, which I kind of sneak in here, is about politics. Politics is hard, but I'm not actually talking about big P politics like presidents and stuff. I'm talking about office politics. How many people here deal with politics in the workplace? I think some of you are lying. Because I think everyone does this, but I had a lot of problems because in the campaign it's very political. It's really, and I say that and everyone's like, well, yeah. But it's very political. It's a lot like House of Cards. It was kind of scary. And I was talking about this, and this friend of mine came in and said, Harper, this is John Maeda, kind of a famous creative, does some really neat stuff at Media Lab and whatnot. He was like, Harper, I know how to solve this problem. And I was just like, how? It seems like a problem that you just have. He's like, no, it's about communication. It's always about communication. Adversarial relationships or political relationships are always about communication. And I didn't really believe him, but he said this tip. Manage by your outbox, not by your inbox. And this tip really changed everything for me. Because what he basically meant was, if you identify a relationship that is adversarial, and you start sending that person email instead of expecting email in return, that it changes the relationship. And so I tested this. I went out there and I said, okay, how do I test this? And I found this person that we didn't really get along. And I sent them an email, just a simple email, just with an update on a product that we were working on together. And the response back was very simple. It was a simple response that just said plainly, thanks for the update. I appreciate the email. And I realized at that point in time that the problem in that relationship wasn't him, it was me. I was not communicating to him, and he expected that. Because in technology, we're oftentimes the service. We're not the reason that people are there. We're providing the reason. And so when I wasn't doing that, I wasn't providing those updates. It was political, so that really helped. Okay, let's get into the data usage stuff. This is one of my favorite topics. Here are our top rules for effectively using data. And like I said, your mileage may vary here, but let's do this. The first one is talking about the marketing hype. This is a big one. I always say, does anyone know the background here? No Public Enemy fans? I talked about big data and how big should be crossed out there, how we should just have this be data. And the reason for that, I'm just going to reiterate, is storage is already solved. And I talked about the questions and answers here. But the thing about this is, all of the things that we do with data every day, how many people have used data their entire careers before big data was important? So this is what I'm saying. Like we can get very far with those regular tools. We don't have to have this big, fancy stuff. How many people know what this is? Excel, right? This is the number one most widely distributed IDE on the planet. This is an important product, this is an important tool. And here's my number one tip for effectively using data. Use Excel. And I am an engineer that ran Linux on the desktop for years. So using Excel, it both pains me and excites me to put this up here. And the reason is simple, because it works. A lot of these other tools are really important, but it's hard to get them going. Another one is, and this is definitely targeted more towards e-commerce, is you have to think aggressively about what is the conversion. We often talk about data, but we don't end up knowing why are we talking about this data, or what do we expect the other side of the data to do. And data always is this thing that gives you answers, and so change must be defensible. How do you defend the change? How do you make sure that change is there, and you can use the data to help that? And what that leads to is you always have to trust the data, right? But one of the problems with data is that it can be manipulated to say whatever you want it to say. I remember my first time I met someone that had gone to business school, and they showed me modeling. And I was like, but I can make a model that says the opposite. And they're like, that's the magic of modeling. And I was like, wow, I don't have to go to business school anymore. And so obviously trust the data, but you have to be skeptical of the data. That's really important. And how many people have seen this movie? Okay, good. This is the #1 movie about multivariate testing. This movie alone is the best way to teach how to do multivariate testing. And so what is it? Just test, always, always test. And obviously repeat everything. That is the key here. And so you have to iterate. It's really easy. Here's 2 quotations about data. The first one was from Jim Messina, the guy who was a draft earlier in the presentation. And it's very simple. This is what he said to us in the very beginning. If there isn't a metric, it doesn't exist. And so this had to do with anything in the campaign. And when I started a company, this is how we ran the company as well. If someone came up and said, Harper, we need to go do this, if they said that without metrics, the conversation was fake. We just threw it out. If they said, we have to go do this, and there's a metric or 2 metrics or some way to measure it, suddenly we have a fruitful conversation. Suddenly we have progress and we have a future. Without metrics, it doesn't exist. The next one is from some friends of mine at Etsy, and this is my favorite one. If it moves, you should graph it. It's very simple, but we often talk about dashboards. We often talk about graphs. When you have a number that moves or changes, graph it. What will you learn from that? Nobody knows. Here's a good one. Track all of the data. Well, actually, I used to say that a lot, but then I started thinking about this more, and I think it actually should be track enough data. And obviously, storage is solved, like I mentioned, but there's a warning here. People. Each data point often is a person. And that's something that we sometimes forget as people who are interacting with data. We're just crunching numbers in Excel, or we're doing some magic, we're manipulating things, we're creating this model that supports a point. But we forget that each person or each piece of data that we have somehow is probably a person that is just sitting there not knowing that you're manipulating them to sell something. And so we have to be careful about this. And the reason why I'll talk about now. How many people are familiar with the famous Target story about data? Okay, how many people are not? Okay, there's a handful, so I'll quickly tell it. So basically, this is one of my favorite stories about data and modeling. Target created this amazing model and kept it secret. And so what happened, or how it came out was this young woman receives a mailer from Target, and the mailer was kind of, I don't remember what it actually said, but I think it said basically, you're pregnant, here's some diapers, buy some stuff. And she was a young woman, maybe 15, and her father was like, that's entirely inappropriate for Target to send to my 15-year-old daughter. So he goes to Target, and he says to the manager, hey, this is inappropriate. The manager obviously takes him off the mailing and all that stuff, takes the daughter off the mailings. And then a few weeks later, the manager calls the father and says, hey, I just want to follow up, make sure you didn't get any more mailings. And the father says, well, actually, my daughter was pregnant. And so the key there was, the daughter didn't know she was pregnant, the father didn't know the daughter was pregnant, Target knew the daughter was pregnant, based on buying patterns. So here's the key, right? Don't be too creepy. The 2 is important there, though, because I guess you can be a little creepy. But the thing here that Target messed up was not having a model that did that, was not tracking buying patterns, all of that stuff, because that stuff they can make a lot of money from, and they can really make it okay for all of us that we feel comfortable with it. The key is that they forgot to mix in the creative. They just showed their model. They basically sent a mailing that was like, here's our model. What you need to do is remember to mix all these things together. You don't want it to just be so overt. And so I'm sure Target still uses this, but now what it is it says like, summer grillin', and then at the bottom it's like, do you need diapers? Here's another one that's very fashionable these days, which is a data breach. I got tired of updating this graph, but since 2013, we've just had a boatload of breaches. And the hard thing is that we oftentimes push this onto the companies or even to the banks to support. But the thing that's hard is this is all of our responsibility. Any of us who make products, it's really important for us to take security very seriously. But finally, I want to go back to that question and answer again. This is really important. And obviously, data is our friend. Is this the biggest data you've seen? So let's talk about product design. So I love product design. This is my favorite thing. Having developed financial products for a bunch of years, here's some of our kind of rules that we've used for the past couple years to kind of build some really great products. So the first one is speed, fast. This is the number one rule. The reason that this is the first rule is because everyone talks about speed, especially engineers or technical folks. We often talk about speed as latency. And I don't want to talk about latency. I want to actually talk about this idea about how do we let the customer or the consumer get what they want faster. It's not the same as latency because there might be a lot of steps in between. And it's not just about making the experience quicker. It's about actually making them act or allowing them to act on intent. This is my favorite word when I talk about experiences within e-commerce or commerce in general, is intent. How do you let the consumer act and follow intent? And one of the ways to do that is to make really simple interfaces. And so I have a very simple rule about building interfaces or building anything with technology, really. In fact, this is one of our main rules at the company that I founded. It was don't be clever. How many people here are clever? There's always one. Okay, there's one that put his hand up that was very clever. But here's the thing about clever. Well, he'll die first of all of us, because he'll do something clever and it won't work out. But here's the thing about clever. Clever is, well, I'll actually tell a very simple thing. We just got done with taxes in the United States. It was April 15th was our tax day. The best way to illustrate cleverness is when your tax accountant comes to you and says, I have a very clever idea. Everyone just runs away, right? You fire that person, you fire your accountant, and you never talk to them again because clever never works. And so this is the thing about engineers. When we think, I have a clever idea, that's when you're like, you are a bad engineer. Because the thing about clever is it feels good because you're like, I am so smart, I'm a clever person, and then it always fails, and that feels bad. But the thing about clever user experiences, or the thing about, we talked about simplicity, is how do you defeat this? Well, I say this simple thing, which is invest in a simple user experience. And I asked how many user experience people were here in the room, and the thing about user experience people is, wait, I'll ask a different question. How many people here build products for users? How many people don't build products for users? Who uses your products? But the thing is it's hard to invest in simple. And so we'll start with something a little easier here, which is just invest in user experience. That's it. And I think we all need to be investing in user experience and doing user experience ourselves, because user experience is the main difference between functional and usable. We can all build and ship functional things. It's very difficult to build and ship usable things. Personalization is really big and really huge, and obviously really important, but it's very easy because right now, I guess it's not very easy, it's very complicated, but it's very easy to talk about, right? All you're doing is trying to decrease the signal-to-noise ratio for that user. And we talk about this in a couple ways, right? The first one is the consumer wants to find the things that they care about, not the things that you care about. And that's one of the main keys with personalization, is just understanding what the user cares about, or train the user to care about the things that you care about. And so we do this a lot with our interfaces by putting up coach marks, by putting up different kind of in-flight training to try and get the user to understand, oh, we are trying to get us on the same page. This works pretty well. Delightful, this one is a little harder to talk about, but I think it's important because we all talk about delightful experiences. This is one of the parlance of kind of technology. How do we talk about delightfulness? Well, I think we can say it about serendipity. When a consumer stumbles across something and they kind of accidentally achieve it, they find the product they love. That's a great experience, and that's when they're like, that was a delightful experience. And so how do we enhance that serendipity? Well, there's a silly kind of equation that I actually really like about luck, which is about when preparation meets opportunity, that's when you find luck. I think serendipity is similar, and so really this is about creating those opportunities for the consumer. Because preparation is what we do every day. We build these experiences. That's the preparation. But the opportunity for them to discover what they want, especially going back to that follow intent, is really important. But the final one here is, I think, the most important thing that we can talk about, which is repetition. Nothing matters with repetition. And I'm actually going to call to a friend to help describe this. How many people know Kanye West? Okay, does anyone here like Kanye West? Does anyone like Kanye West anywhere? I love Kanye West. Kanye West is great. But the thing about Kanye West is Kanye West seems crazy. And I like that about Kanye West. And so you got to be careful, though, because this interview with Kanye West, I was like, man, Kanye's crazy. I'm going to check out this interview where he says crazy things. And the first thing he says is this: innovation gets almost too much credit. How many people here work in innovation? Okay, I'm sorry, everyone. Those people anyway. So innovation gets almost too much credit. Like there's this idea that innovation is what we're all doing. Well, Kanye says, no, there's no money in innovation. Because the thing is that we often, well, what does Kanye say next? So Kanye says, the money is in repetition. And this is what really resonated with me. Because we talk a lot about innovation, but innovation is one. That's innovative. Just one thing we've done. But unless it's repeated, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters then, the only story that matters then is repetition. Repetition matters. So we think of success. We think of something like an Uber or an iPhone. Nokia was very innovative. That didn't get them anywhere. The iPhone was able to take those innovations and put it in the hands of all of us, and then that got somewhere. And so when you look back at history, no one remembers those great Nokia devices because it didn't matter. Innovation gets you nothing. And so what I want to talk about is how do we test things, how to repeat those tests, and then how do we weaponize our products to get them out there, preferably aerosol. Thank you. That's all I got. I'd love to answer some questions, if there are any. And thanks for having me. Any questions? Oh, yes, right there. Great.
Thanks. Great presentation. I'm just wondering, because you have, is it on? Hello. Yeah. Because we have now again an election in the US, and I haven't seen so much talk about big data or use of social media or anything like it. So I'm wondering, was this only for the Obama election, or is it being used but not talked about now?
I think it's being used quite a bit, the technology and whatnot. It's more complicated because it turns out that the voters don't want to hear about this, because it leads those questions to, is this like 1984? And all sorts of other complicated questions, when really it's not. It's just advertising. It's just brand building. And so they try and not talk about it right now during the election. They always talk about it after the election. And I mean, everyone that is watching knows what's happening. But if you look, if does anyone here receive emails from any of the campaigns in the US? Okay, everyone, yeah, there's always a couple that are like, I'm trying to unsubscribe. But the emails are the quickest way to tell. If anyone wants to see how the modeling and the data works, just subscribe about 50 email addresses to one candidate, and you'll see the testing that's happening there. But the key is that you never want, like the Target example, you never want people to notice that you're doing this work. Because if they notice, then the magic is gone. It's that Wizard of Oz moment for suddenly you see the kind of weird, nerdy, pale engineers in the back who are doing all the work. You don't want that to become apparent. You always want this facade of like normality. Oh, this is just the experience everyone else has. Because when you get caught, it never works, whether it's Amazon with price changes, whether it's airlines with price changes, or Target, or whatever. Any other questions? Oh, one over here on the right. We have a mic coming to you.
Hi, personalization and basically there's a lot of financial institutions in here, online banks, that are maybe going to be fighting for people's attention with fintech companies stealing their customers.
Sorry.
Yeah, too bad. But there's this idea about designing for habit and basically addiction in apps like Facebook. You reach for your phone when you wake up. And then there's this other church of design for time well spent, which is kind of coming along and saying,
What was the second church?
like designing for time well spent. So if you can help me without me spending all of my waking hours in the application. So maybe can you reflect on that? Because there's a lot of addicting apps out there now.
Yeah, let me try and rephrase it just so I understand. So the first one was the kind of the church of addiction. Is that correct? And the
Yeah, so
second one
building
was
the
the
most
church of
addictive.
time well spent. Is that
Yeah.
Okay, so I think very simply, I can't actually build anything that I wouldn't want to use, and I would never build something for myself that was about addiction. That seems negative. I try and lead a pretty positive life. And so time well spent seems really positive. But obviously I'm not king.com, right? I'm not building these famous games in Candy Crush and all that. Anyone here play Candy Crush? Okay, definitely people lying. Well, and obviously that works, but when I think about consumer experiences or bank experiences or financial experiences, I don't want gamification. And I think the reason there is because of the game in that word, the game in gamification. I think that changes how we as the builders treat our consumers. We're not creating games, we're creating livelihood, we're creating jobs, we're creating businesses. And if we treat it as games, then we're not going to take it serious, and we're not going to treat those experiences to what the people on the other end are assuming is going to be the case. That doesn't mean that we can't learn from those experiences. For example, in the company Modest that was bought by PayPal, one of our key tenets is that everything should be undoable. So if you buy something and you don't want it, you should just be able to unbuy it. Like, why is it that we can upload a photo to Instagram and delete it after 2 hours, but we can't do that to an e-commerce purchase? When really, e-commerce is just putting it in a database. You don't have to deal with CDNs and all these content distribution and all our devices and all this other stuff that actually makes deleting content really hard. And so we were just like, why is this? And it turns out that I don't know if anyone has really thought why. It just turns out that no, it's actually really easy and the consumers expect it. And so I say that don't think about it as there's two churches. Just think about it as two places to observe. The first one is you're looking at gaming and gamification and you're saying, what can we learn from this? What are the things that people are using, the behaviors or the patterns that we're watching our users fall into or enjoy that we can take and learn? And maybe it's about alerts, or it's about notifications, or there's a bank in the US called Simple that does some light gamification around savings, which is very interesting. And then the second one is, how do we make sure that when we're building these interfaces that we're building interfaces that are honestly for ourselves or that we would want to use? Because that's one of the things I think happens, especially in fintech, is we build interfaces for people who aren't us. Whether it's a consumer, we're like, well, I would never use this. Well, that's probably the first problem. I would want to build an interface, regardless of who it's for, where I would say, I wish I could use this. And I think if you just start changing that language a little bit, then the answer will come, which church you should belong to, and it's probably none of them. Next question.
Hi, yeah. Thank you for a very illuminating keynote. It was interesting to watch. I have a question that's kind of implicit in your talk. So you've been kind of talking a little bit about privacy sort of implicitly here. And I wondered if things have changed in the past 8 years since you did the campaign. Do people's expectations towards privacy, has that shifted? Is there a generational divide? Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I actually love this topic because I think it's really complex. So I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question real quick. How many people here are above 25? Okay, how many people here are below 25 or 25? Okay, there's 2 or 3. So here's the thing. Now we're going to call the people who are above 25, we are the olds. We're the old people. And anyone below 25 is the young people. And what I started to notice was a couple years ago talking about this was very simply that there's a few ages that you can call out where the language around privacy has completely changed. So us old people who are kind of above 25, our language around privacy is much different, and our arguments for privacy are much different than the young people. And when you start looking at it, it sounds an awful lot like the stories my parents told me about rock and roll. Like, your music is too loud, turn it down. Those kind of stories about privacy. It's like, well, you know, I had a conversation. How many people here are familiar with Snapchat? When Snapchat, who does anyone here use Snapchat? I love Snapchat. It is so awesome. But I was told about Snapchat by a high schooler. And immediately I was like, what would I do with pictures that disappear? Right? And so that was an old joke. That was an old people joke. Because young people, when I talk to young people, you're like, well, are you going to take like naked pictures with that? They're like, why would I do it with Snapchat? I take it with all of the apps. Whereas you talk to old people and they're thinking about photos, and you can there's a quick test, which is when you think about a photo, and I'll get to privacy. When you think about a photo, and like your house is burning down, and you're like, what are you going to save? You're going to be like, I'm going to save my box of photos, because in our brain, because we're old, the photos all have a tag on it that says permanent. We have to keep those photos around forever. But when you've grown up with a device that you can throw into a river, and you can get a new device and all your content is still there, and you don't have the physical photos, you don't have photo albums in the same way that olds do, then you suddenly have this idea that photos are no longer permanent. And so suddenly we're in the midst of like a Kuhnian paradigm shift where the word photo means something for people who are younger than it does for old people. And so I think privacy has a lot of these similar concepts of what is privacy is something that us old people should ask ourselves, but not think that our answer will include the young people. Because my biggest concern, and we see this in some places, like Germany has a lot of data protection and privacy laws for very, very good reason. But there's this kind of thing that's happening, which is a lot of startups that are building consumer apps move to other countries to build their apps because they cannot be innovative, they cannot build working products in Germany based on these data laws. So we have to be very careful that we don't accidentally legislate our views of privacy and stifle innovation or stifle young people from just being themselves. So that's kind of where I sit on privacy. With that said, it's hard to be like the CTO for Obama that had written internet freedom on his arms and then have Snowden come out. That was awkward. But you know, it is a little bit what it is. It's kind of a weird world where surveillance is all assumed. But yeah, you know, privacy is important. I think like security, it's probably up to us. I always run everything through a, you know, is this creepy test? And if it's creepy to an old person, that doesn't mean it's creepy to a young person. So ask twice, I guess. Any other questions? Oh yeah, right over here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask, what has been your biggest challenge for you in your hacking career, and what have you learned from it?
I think the biggest challenge for me, it's really hard to be this cool. I'm trying to think what an actual challenge is. You know, I actually, challenges are hard to think back on because as a developer, you learn so much to be very iterative. And so when you look, like if you're programming and you make a mistake and you fix it, you don't look back and think it was a mistake. It's just on the journey. So I don't really look back and think of challenges. But I think a couple hard things were just dealing with the insiders and outsiders. Throughout my career, I've always been the outsider. Like I either was brought in as a solver, and that's never a good kind of, it's like this person will solve all of our problems, and then you're just like, you know, a messiah sitting there, oh, I'll solve everything for you, which is not good. No one likes that person. Being a change agent always sucks. The change agent, I don't think ever lives, much like the clever person. And so it's a little bit of that, but those aren't really challenges, right? Those are privileges in many cases. So I don't really know if I have any challenges, but that doesn't mean I didn't struggle. Focus is always hard because there's so much cool stuff to do. Like recently I've been really into photography, but also drones. I guess those two things mix kind of, but you know, there's a lot of just neat stuff. So focus is hard. What I always try and do is after a career, because every one of my careers are a little short, you know, 4 to 6 years. After a career, I try and take some time to decompress so I don't make rash decisions. because I really enjoy rash decisions. So you have to make sure you don't just start suddenly like, yes, I'll work for you, Intel, or yes, I'll work for you, giant company, because I know I like smaller companies. I know I barely answered that question, but I have to think about it. That was a hard one. Any other questions? Maybe one more? Or 0 more, that's fine too. Well, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to speak, and thanks for having me here in Iceland. It's wonderful. You have a very beautiful country. Thank you.